my husband.
I mean, you're not gonna have me.
Like, you don't always come to my stuff because of my...
Y'all, what if the real reason a marriage ended wasn't the cheating everyone saw, but the quiet destruction nobody noticed until it was too late? Because for years, the world looked at Tina Campbell and Teddy Campbell as a story of betrayal, forgiveness, and survival. A scandal did a comeback, a perfect couple that almost broke but didn't. But that version, it might not be the full story. Because now, Tina is speaking again, and this time, she's not talking about what happened publicly. She's talking about what was happening inside the marriage, behind the image. And according to what's being revealed, this wasn't just about cheating. This was about losing yourself while trying to save something that was already gone. I stayed longer than I should have, she admits. Not because she didn't see the signs, but because she kept believing things would change. And that's where it gets heavier. Because sources say this wasn't one mistake. IT wasn't one moment. It was a pattern, a cycle, a version of reality that looked stable on the outside, but felt completely broken on the inside. And when that kind of damage builds over time, it doesn't explode all at once. It collapses. So now the question isn't just why the marriage ended, it's how long it was already over before anyone realized. And if what Tina is saying is even partially true, then everything people thought they knew about this relationship might have been an illusion.
Is that hard? Is that a big ask?
No, normally, this is different. My artists are coming.
It wasn't the cheating that ended it. That's the part people think they understand. But according to what's now being revealed, the real reason this marriage collapsed didn't happen in one moment. It built slowly, quietly, underneath everything the public could see. For years, Tina Campbell and Teddy Campbell were presented as a story of struggle and survival. A relationship tested, exposed, and then seemingly repaired. From the outside, it looked like they had already faced the worst. But that version leaves something out. Because what Tina is now describing isn't a single betrayal. It's a pattern that didn't stop when the headlines faded. And that's where the shift begins. Because instead of focusing on what happened publicly, she's pointing toward what continued privately, long after people assumed things were fixed. I didn't leave because of one thing, she explains. And that changes the entire framework. Because if it wasn't one thing, then it wasn't one decision. It was accumulation. Moments stacking on top of each other. Signals that didn't make sense at first, but became clearer over time. That's the first twist. This wasn't a sudden ending. It was a delayed one. And according to her, the real damage wasn't always visible. It didn't always show up in arguments or confrontations. Sometimes it showed up in absence, in silence, in the gradual feeling that something fundamental was no longer there. She describes a shift in how the relationship felt. Not loud, not explosive, but heavy, like being present in something that no longer recognized you. I felt alone even when we were together. That's the line people keep repeating, because it reframes everything. This isn't just about betrayal.
In 2013, where infidelity rocked the core of the family. It's all on you, Teddy.
Yeah, I mean,
It's about disconnection. And disconnection is harder to identify, because it doesn't always have a clear starting point. But once it sets in, it spreads. That's where the second layer begins to surface. Because alongside that emotional distance, she alludes to something else. A life that didn't fully include her anymore. Not necessarily hidden, but divided. A version of reality that operated on two levels. One that people saw, and one that she lived. And those two versions didn't align. That's what created the tension. Not a single act, but a mismatch between perception and reality. According to her, that mismatch didn't happen overnight. It developed, gradually, through repeated moments where things didn't feel right, but weren't clear enough to confront directly. And that's where the backstory becomes important. Because when you look at it from that perspective, the earlier issues don't appear as isolated incidents. They start to look like indicators. Early signs of something that was never fully resolved. Which means the end of the marriage wasn't caused by something new.
as a kid, I filtered everything through it. Everything. So when loneliness showed up in my marriage, I went back to the old Ted. That's exactly how it happened. So you have to...
It was the result of something ongoing. That's what makes this different. Because instead of a clean break triggered by a single event, this feels like the final point in a process that had already been unfolding. And that process changes how everything is interpreted. It shifts the focus from what happened to what was happening all along. That's why her tone matters. It's not reactive. It's reflective. As if she's describing something she understands now, but couldn't fully see while she was inside it. I kept trying to fix something that wasn't whole anymore. That statement adds another layer. Because it suggests awareness came late, after the damage had already spread. And that's where escalation becomes inevitable. Because once you recognize that something is broken beyond repair, staying doesn't stabilize it. It intensifies it. Every unresolved issue becomes heavier. Every moment feels more strained, until the only option left is to step out of it entirely. And that's what she describes. Not as a reaction, but as a realization. A point where continuing no longer made sense. Where holding on was doing more harm than letting go. That's the difference she's drawing between leaving because of anger and leaving because of clarity. And that raises a question that changes how the entire situation is viewed. If the relationship had been slowly breaking long before it ended, then was the public ever seeing it as it really was? It didn't end with the decision to leave. It started there. Because once Tina Campbell began explaining why the marriage actually ended, the focus shifted from a single event to something far more difficult to define. A slow, internal breakdown that had been building for years. The public version was simple. Infidelity. Conflict. Separation. But the version she's describing now doesn't follow that structure. It expands it. According to her, the visible issues were only part of it. The deeper damage came from something less obvious, something that didn't always have a clear moment you could point to. It wasn't always loud. It was persistent. And that persistence is what made it harder to recognize while it was happening. But here's where the shift becomes more noticeable. Because instead of focusing on what he did, she begins to describe what she experienced. A difference that matters. Because it moves the narrative away from accusation and into impact. I kept trying to hold everything together, she explains. Not once. Not temporarily. Consistently. And that introduces the first twist. Because the effort to preserve the relationship didn't happen in isolation. It happened while the foundation underneath it was already unstable. Which means every attempt to fix things wasn't strengthening it. It was stretching it. That's the core dynamic she's pointing toward. A relationship that looked intact, but required constant effort just to maintain the appearance of stability. And over time, that kind of effort becomes unsustainable. That's where the core drama takes shape. Because this isn't just about betrayal. It's about imbalance. One person holding on, one person gradually pulling away. And that imbalance doesn't create immediate collapse. It creates tension. A slow, continuous tension that builds until something gives. She describes moments where things didn't feel aligned. Where conversations didn't resolve anything. Where reassurance didn't match behavior. And those moments didn't stand out individually. But together, they formed a pattern. That's the word she keeps returning to. Pattern. Not coincidence. Not misunderstanding. A sequence of experiences that repeated in different forms. And repetition changes how something is perceived. Because once something happens more than once, it stops feeling accidental. It starts to feel structural. That's when doubt becomes certainty. Not overnight, but gradually. That's where the interview tone shifts. Less about confusion, more about recognition. I started to see things differently, she admits. Not because something new happened, but because she began interpreting what had already been happening in a different way. That's the second twist. The realization didn't come from a new event. It came from a new perspective. And once that perspective changes, everything else follows. Past moments take on new meaning. Conversations feel different in hindsight. Decisions that once seemed reasonable begin to feel misaligned. That's how the narrative deepens. Because now the story isn't just moving forward. It's being reevaluated backward. And that's where the backstory becomes more significant. Because when she looks back, the earlier issues don't feel isolated anymore. They connect, forming a continuous thread that leads directly to the end. Which suggests that the ending wasn't unexpected. It was delayed. And delay creates a specific kind of damage. Because it extends the time someone stays in something that's already shifting beneath them. That's what she's describing. Not a sudden collapse, but a prolonged one. And prolonged collapse affects everything around it. Emotional stability, clarity, sense of self. She hints at that loss without overstating it. I didn't recognize myself anymore, she says. And that line reframes the entire situation. Because now it's not just about what happened between two people. It's about what happened to her within that relationship. That's where escalation becomes unavoidable. Because once someone reaches a point where they feel disconnected from themselves, staying no longer feels like loyalty. It feels like damage. And damage, when it continues without resolution, doesn't stay contained. It spreads into decisions, into reactions, into the eventual choice to leave. And when that choice finally happens, it often looks sudden from the outside. But internally, it's the result of something that's been forming for a long time. That's what she's trying to communicate. The difference between how it looked and how it felt. And that difference is what complicates everything. Because it suggests that the public wasn't seeing the relationship as it actually was. They were seeing a version of it that was maintained, managed, presented, while something else existed beneath it. And that leads to the question that continues to sit unresolved. If the real damage wasn't visible when it was happening, then how much of what people believed about that marriage was ever accurate? It didn't end when she filed. It ended long before that. Quietly, gradually, in ways no one outside could measure. Because by the time Tina Campbell made the decision official, the relationship she was leaving wasn't the same one people thought they were watching. From the outside, it still carried structure, shared history, public presence, familiar roles. But internally, according to what she's now describing, those elements no longer connected the way they once did. And that's where the final shift begins. Because instead of explaining the ending as a reaction, she frames it as recognition. A point where the difference between what was visible and what was real became too large to ignore. But here's where it becomes more complicated. Because recognition doesn't happen all at once. It builds. Through moments that don't align. Through conversations that don't resolve. Through a growing sense that something fundamental has changed, even if you can't define exactly what. That's the space she describes. Not confusion, but awareness that arrives slowly. And once that awareness settles, everything else starts to reorganize around it. That's the first twist. Because the decision to leave wasn't triggered by a single event. It was the result of something that had already shifted internally. Which means by the time the ending became visible, the relationship had already been functioning differently for a long time. That's the part people didn't see. The internal timeline. The version of events that doesn't translate into headlines, but determines everything that follows. And that's where the core drama deepens. Because once someone reaches that point, where staying requires more emotional cost than leaving, every additional moment becomes harder to justify. Not because of what's happening externally, but because of what's happening internally. She describes a state where effort no longer produced connection, where communication no longer produced clarity, where presence no longer produced stability. And those shifts don't announce themselves. They accumulate, until the structure they're part of no longer holds. That's what she's pointing to. A breakdown that wasn't sudden, but became unavoidable. And then comes the second layer. Because alongside that internal shift, there's the external expectation. The version of the relationship that people believed in. The image that had been maintained over time. And those expectations don't disappear just because the reality changes. They continue, which creates tension between what people expect to see and what actually exists. That tension is difficult to sustain because it requires constant adjustment, constant presentation, constant alignment between perception and reality. And eventually, that alignment becomes impossible. That's when the structure gives way, not because it failed suddenly, but because it could no longer be maintained. That's the backstory she's indirectly reconstructing. Not a sequence of dramatic events, but a progression of subtle changes that led to a definitive outcome. And when you look at it that way, the earlier issues don't stand alone. They connect, forming a continuous line from the beginning of the visible cracks to the final decision to leave, which suggests that the ending wasn't just the result of what people saw. It was the result of everything that came before it. That's where the interview tone becomes more grounded, less reactive, more certain. I knew I couldn't stay, she says. Not as a question, not as doubt, but as conclusion. And that conclusion carries weight, because it reflects a point where uncertainty has already been resolved internally, where the decision isn't about whether to leave, but about accepting that leaving is the only option left. That's where escalation reaches its peak. Because once that point is reached, the outcome becomes inevitable. Not immediate, but inevitable. Every remaining moment becomes transitional, a movement towards something that has already been decided. And when the decision finally becomes public, it often looks abrupt, unexpected, even disproportionate. But that perception only exists because the internal process wasn't visible, which brings everything back to the same unresolved question. If the real ending happened long before the official one, then how much of what people believed they were watching was ever real? And how much of it was simply being held together until it couldn't be anymore? And this is where the story stops being about a breakup and starts becoming about what was real in the first place. Because if what Tina Campbell is saying lines up, even partially, then the version people believed for years wasn't just incomplete. It was curated, carefully held together, repeated, protected, until it couldn't be sustained anymore. And that changes everything. Because now the question isn't who cheated or who left. It's deeper than that. It's about how long someone can stay inside something that's already broken just to keep the image alive. Meanwhile, Teddy Campbell hasn't fully dismantled this narrative. And that silence? It's not empty. It's being watched. Every pause, every delay, every word that hasn't been said yet is adding pressure to a situation that's already unstable. Because when one side speaks with clarity and the other side holds back, the story doesn't slow down. It accelerates. Now, the audience isn't just listening. They're analyzing, comparing, choosing what feels true. And that's where it becomes unpredictable. Because once public perception locks in, even the truth can struggle to catch up. So here's what it comes down to. If this wasn't just about cheating, if this wasn't just about conflict, then what actually held that marriage together for so long? And more importantly, what finally made it impossible to pretend anymore? Because if this is only one side of the story being fully understood now, then the real ending might still be unfolding.